Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the RP podcast, where we aim to bridge the gap between rehab and performance. I'm your host, Connor, and today I'm joined by a special guest. Today, we are continuing our bone loading series, and today we have brought on Frances Brown to help us out. So, Frances Brown, her business is FKBphysio. So, if you've seen it on socials, you'll know that she's interested in all things bone loading, bone density, and helping people with chronic pain conditions. She has a master's in sports medicine physiotherapy, and she's been running her own business for the last 4 years. Welcome to the podcast, Frances.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. That sounds really good, a bone loading series.
Yeah. So I think this is maybe the third or fourth one we're in. So it'd be awesome. We haven't actually talked about osteoporosis yet. So awesome to get a real expert and reliable source in to help us talk about this one. We've
Okay.
enjoyed following you and everything you do on your podcast, but also usually Instagram is where I see everything. So for the listeners who aren't familiar with you, would you like to give yourself a little introduction and just let us know kind of your story?
Yes. So you've covered the basics there. So I've been a physio since 2010, and I probably, just like a lot of people, went straight into private practice kind of work and did that for 5 years. And it was kind of pre-social media-ish back then, and I got relatively disillusioned because it was very much sort of the old school way. And then I moved to the UK and spent a few years over there, and then spent a few years working in the Middle East, and did a lot of exercise based rehab in those two settings. And when I came back to Australia, I knew that I didn't want to do the kind of traditional model of physiotherapy that I'd worked in before, because I just couldn't go back to it after spending so much time working on the gym floor and having these long appointments with people. So I thought I'd just try starting my own business and seeing how it went. And yes, 4 years in, it is going well. And yeah, something I love about it is just that I can practice exactly how I want. And it's just kind of happened at the type of patients I have attracted. They just tend to be the types of patients that I want. And that often they are people that have this really long story where they've had heaps of different things going on for them. And I have the time to sit down with them and go through it all. And it's just, I often think about it, that it's just really enjoyable to practice in this way. So yeah, it's good. This far
Aw-
into the career, I'm glad to say that I'm still really enjoying it.
Awesome. Good to hear. And you're a lifter as well. So I'm assuming kind of that's maybe a little bit of a gateway into how you got into this area.
Yeah, like I have always loved the gym. I've been teaching body attack, like an aerobics class, since I was 17. And I got into lifting weights, I think, in about 2015. And that is definitely, it all sort of coincided with, I'd started lifting weights myself, love being in gyms, and saw this disconnect between the types of exercises we'd give as physios to what people were doing in the gym. And because I've never really played sport, I probably didn't realize that disconnect earlier on. But I'm thinking, how come the people in the gym, like I'm very, inverted commas, I'm weak at doing these little tiny physio exercises, but then I'm kind of strong on the gym exercises. And I just realized, hold on, this isn't really making sense. And found Adam Meakin's, like, read all his blogs and
Mhm.
everything. And so definitely being in the gym helped. It helped, yeah, send me to where I am now, which was basically just, I created my dream job of being able to wear gym clothes at work and work in a gym. So it's the best.
Awesome. So
Hmm.
glad that you've kind of found your own little niche. How did you kind of get into the osteoporosis space?
Yeah. So that also kind of happened. It's again, it's all kind of just worked out really well in that, as I say, I got really into the gym. I really like lifting weights. I started using the gym type exercise as rehab for most of my clients. And then
Mhm.
when I came home and decided to start my business, my mum and her friends uh, wanted to start doing weight training with me. And so I thought, okay, yeah, that's good. I'll start doing that. And because they have osteoporosis, it prompted me to go and look up a bunch of research on osteoporosis, look up the guidelines, kind of see what was out there, and realize that, of course, lifting heavy weights was going to be the best thing for them. And so it was this excellent way to get people doing what I thought they should be doing, often endorsed by their GP. And so they sort of referred all their friends. And then the word sort of got out that that's what I was doing. And so it's just sort of grown from there. So it all just kind of worked out really well that it's exactly what I want to be doing. And it's this way to do it. There's this way to do it that people are really interested in.
Unreal. So you've kind of had a bit of experience in a few different settings of physiotherapy and lifting and exercise, and then kind of bring it all together in what you do at the minute. So awesome. Good to hear.
Yeah. And like
So,
when I worked in the Middle East, I worked in a gym with
mhm,
like exercise scientists. And I have to say, like 2 years of working on a gym floor with exercise scientists, almost in the capacity of like a personal trainer myself. I reckon if you've got a physio qualification and you work alongside exercise scientists in a gym setting and learn about programming. I did do like a personal training course while I was over there. And honestly, I feel like having the background knowledge of physio combined with a knowledge of programming, combined with like experience working with exercise scientists, that's quite a good base to then use exercise as rehab most of the time. Like I feel like a lot of it you can figure out. I feel like because we're physios,
mm,
the thought of doing something you haven't necessarily got, like I haven't got an exercise science degree, but I'm using mostly exercise. But I reckon it is the sort of thing that you can learn it like practically a lot.
mhm. And that pretty much confirms every single bias that we have on the podcast here, and pretty much everything we've talked about in the previous 20 episodes before this. So yeah,
Okay, that's good.
definitely in agreement with you there. So yeah, today, all those kind of concepts you just mentioned about using exercise and programming and understanding conditions, and from both like an exercise and a physiotherapy standpoint, we're hoping to kind of do with osteoporosis today. So kind of to dive into the topic, what is osteoporosis and how do you diagnose it?
Okay, so osteoporosis is basically diagnosed through officially it's diagnosed by a DEXA scan. So a scan that can see the density of your bones, and it's a diagnosis made based on comparison, which sounds a bit confusing, but it's basically when you're 30, it's the most dense, strong your bones are ever going to be. And in theory, your bone density slowly starts to decline from age 30. And so when you get a bone density scan, they're looking at how far away your bones are from a 30-year-old of your sex and ethnicity. And so osteoporosis means you're more than 2.5 standard deviations away from that 30-year-old person. Osteopenia is kind of the precursor. So osteopenia is if you're between 1 and 2.4 standard deviations away. And then anything other than that is considered normal. So when you're over 50, I think it is, they use that's your T-score, those numbers. So they'll use your T-score to go, okay, this is how far away you are from a 30-year-old, and this is your diagnosis of osteoporosis. But there are people who are in their 30s or 40s getting diagnosed with this. And I sort of have thought before, how can someone be like 37 and already have osteoporosis? It doesn't mean that their bones are as low bone density as someone who's 80 who has osteoporosis, because when you're under 50, they use a Z score to diagnose it. So Z score is the same theory, but it's how far you are away from someone your current age.
Right.
So the way I think of it is just that, say you're 40 and your bone density has been going down faster than it should. It's only had 10 years since you were 30 to go down more rapidly. It's never going to be as low as someone who's been going down for 40 years, who's 80. But it's good to kind of catch it when you're 40 and go, oh, it's gone down more than other 40-year-olds of this age. And so it's a kind of a warning sign to go, you're on a pathway to it being continuously lower, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. So that's your T score.
T score is how far away it is from a 30-year-old, and Z score is how far away it is from people your age.
Your own age. Yeah. Okay. Perfect. And
Yeah.
then we're diagnosing osteoporosis if it's more than 2.5 standard deviations from what the average is in people your age or the average 30-year-old.
Yeah. And so, it is kind of age dependent. And so if you're under 50, they'll diagnose you with osteoporosis if you're 2.5 standard deviations away from other people who are 50. And if you're over 50, it's more than 2.5 standard deviations away from someone who's 30. So it isn't like, I find that really confusing because it's
Mm-hmm.
not set. It's not like once it drops below this level, you have it, because it's all relative. Most people's scans have both. And so you can get people who are, say, 80, and their T score, so how far away they are from someone who's 30, is almost inevitably going to be below mine. It's going to be in the minus, because going down for so many years, they're almost definitely going to have osteopenia, but they might be better than other 80-year-olds. And so their Z score might be like +1.
Yep.
So that can be interesting to see. So sometimes I say to the people, oh, like relative to your age, you're actually going really well. But unfortunately, most people in their 80s have osteopenia. So unfortunately, you have that, but you're still doing well relative to your age. So I do kind of go through that with them a little bit.
Okay. And then obviously the risks of getting more severe osteoporosis or having a lower Z score or T score, depending on kind of what your age is, leaves you at like greater risk of getting fractures and things like that. Is it put you at greater risk for anything else that you know of?
I think the fractures is the really big one. And there's vertebral fractures, which are sort of crush fractures that can happen from not much, and they sort of result in like increased kyphosis and loss of height. But then there's also insufficiency fractures elsewhere in the body, or low trauma fractures. So fractures that happen from something really small. So some of my clients, they've done something like falling from a standing height is considered low trauma. So if you're just standing up and you fall down and break your wrist, that's sort of considered not what's meant to happen if you have healthy bones. I've had people who've like pushed against something heavy and cracked their ribs. That happens to a few of them. And then there is obviously the risk if you have a fall, like an actual kind of bigger fall, of breaking a hip. That's the one that most people are really worried about. But I think it's important to know about all of them, because if someone's like 55, they're really active and stuff, they kind of know that they're not going to have a fall anytime soon. And so the threat, I suppose, of a broken hip sort of is not something that is really something they're going to be conscious of, but they are at risk of those little insufficiency fractures. And I've had people who've had them, unfortunately, from just like jumping off the bottom step or something like that, or they've like lunged and they've gotten a knee fracture in their knee. Yeah. So those are the biggest risks I can think of for osteoporosis. And I guess something else to say as well is that the DEXA scan and the diagnosis, it's not perfect. It's just the best we've got, because the thought is that it's important as well, the structure of your bones, like what they actually look like inside, and whether the outside bit of the bone is thicker rather than thinner, and those sort of things aren't measured by a DEXA. So I just think of it as a screening tool. And so it's really important to know if you are on track for osteoporosis or osteopenia, so you start doing something about it, as opposed to like using those numbers as a hard and fast rule. Because again, a few of my clients who've had the most sort of low trauma, surprising fractures are only osteopenic. They're not osteoporotic. And so, you look at them and think, oh, like that's very unlikely that that's happened to you, when your bone density apparently isn't that bad, but presumably it's that the structure isn't great.
Okay. So DEXA scan's more of a screening tool, and people who have osteopenia haven't quite developed through to osteoporosis yet can still get these low-level fractures, and also obviously the higher impact fractures from falls and things like that. Are there any other kind of more sensitive tests, or is DEXA as far as you would bother going?
I reckon DEXA, because that's what people can access. The only like more hectic ones I know of are people who do them in studies, and I actually don't even know what they're doing. But when you read these studies about osteoporosis, they will have measured all these different sites, and they can tell about the thickness of the bone and things. But I feel like for your average person, they don't need to know that. DEXA scan also only shows lower back, like lumbar spine and hips. And if you have arthritis, it can give you this false inflated result, because if you have arthritis and there's extra kind of bony growth, it perceives it as more dense. So there are issues there. And if you've had a hip replacement, again, nothing's perfect, but it's the best we've got.
Okay. And like you said, it only measures the hip and the lumbar spine. So you're not getting like upper limb.
No.
Sometimes they take distal radius, don't they? Or I've seen,
like they probably do. Every machine. And something else to note as well is that the science isn't perfect. and you need to get it done on the same machine, or at least the same brand of machine every time. And that sort of shows you how inaccurate it must be, that even the people doing it are saying you need to come back to the same machine or your result won't be the same. But still, it's a screening tool, best we've got. And just to give an idea of prevalence of osteoporosis as well, the stats are that 66% of all Australians over 50 have poor bone health. And like I double checked, and that means osteopenia or osteoporosis. So 2/3 of all people over 50 have it. And I think out of those, it's a fifth have osteoporosis.
Okay.
And that's just over 50. And as you get older, it kind of just goes up. So heaps, I kind of now view it as if you live long enough, you're going to get osteoporosis, osteopenia. And so, especially if you're female. And so the goal is to try to stave it off for as long as possible. That's how I'm looking at it.
Yep. So it's not a death sentence. We can work with it. It's something that you can improve your bone density. And you can do that at any age, is from what my understanding is. So you can kind of lower your risk.
Yeah, you can lower your risk and like put it off. I feel like if you're living to 90, the likelihood if you get it is really like, because your bone density has been going down for 60 years. But I also think the research would be so behind on this because people haven't been lifting heavy and trying to do all these things to stop it, you know, quite recently. And so obviously when you read things, it's sort of very much like, yep, it's going to just keep going down and it's inevitable, just trying to put it off. But I wonder whether that's actually true or not, because I remember learning at uni in like 2007 or something, that you couldn't improve it. And that was like definitive. You can't improve it. You can only stop it going down. And they've changed that now. So who knows what we'll see in the future.
Learning more and more all the time, which is cool. It's like a bit of a public health thing. Like if it's a disease process that we can stop or mitigate the risks of becoming really, really prevalent, or like kind of a high cause of mortality in the community, then awesome. Like we're definitely some of the best placed professions to like address this. So yeah, I think that's one of the reasons we're spending so much time on this bone loading series, is because we kind of see the impact and the benefit that it can seriously have on people's lives. So
yeah. I think people need to know. I find that all the time. I feel like people need to know. And it is, I feel, especially women historically are not encouraged to do like heavy lifting or maybe high impact types of exercise, especially if they're pregnant or have given birth. You know, often they've been told directly, never lift again or never jump again. And then they're getting to sort of 50, 60 and they have osteoporosis, osteopenia. And I just feel like if at least we need to just try and tell everybody about it, and then they can choose to try and do something about it or not. But I feel like I've had heaps of clients who just didn't know, and they found out for the first time in their 60s and they're thinking, I love exercise. I would have chosen lifting instead of cycling if I'd known. So yes, we need to get the word out.
That informed consent.
Yeah.
So on that, say someone comes in and they've just been freshly diagnosed with osteopenia or osteoporosis, how would you go about describing that to them? Because it can be pretty scary to hear that you've got like weak, or like commonly like GPs, and this is not their fault or anything, but they'll say brittle bones. That can be a pretty kind of nasibic thing to overcome. So yeah, how would you go about explaining that to someone?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that like a lot of the time when they come, I sort of gauge where they're at with it. I suppose a lot of them, it's osteopenia only at this point. And they sort of just go, oh, I'm losing bone density. So they sort of know that their bone, I guess it's just bone health or bone strength. And they sort of go, I know that my bone density is getting lower and I want to do what I can to slow it down. And so if they use that sort of language, I just go with that because that doesn't sound scary. I have had one woman whose was really, it was like very progressed. And the person who did her DEXA scan said to her, like, go straight home. Don't do anything until you've seen the doctor about this. And this was someone who was like like an ultra endurance kind of trail runner who had been running. It's really tricky. I suppose I do find it a bit of a balance in that you want to make sure they know how important it is to address it. but you don't want to freak them out. And so I probably have lots of my clients, I suppose they're not very frail, like they're
Mhm.
in their 50s, in their 60s, they're active. And so they're not feeling particularly fragile. And I don't really need to go into it with them, but I'm just thinking if they were a little bit older, I suppose I would try and address it. If they said they're brittle bones, I'd probably just say to them, oh, they're not brittle. They've just lost a bit of their strength,
Mhm.
and we can build it back up, to a better level and get your muscle stronger around it and make everything else function much better to help support your skeleton more, and sort of just try and get away from the brittle bone. It's hard if they've already had a fracture because they're already feeling
Mhm.
like that. But I guess lots of the time if they've had a fracture, they've been put on medication. And so sometimes I do lean on that a little bit and go, oh, but you're on the medication now, so that's going to be making things better almost immediately.
Mhm.
Which I did
Yeah.
have to look up and check if that was true, which it seems like it does work quite fast to at least reduce fracture risk to an extent.
Okay, cool. So rather than using the word brittle or weak, you're just saying you've lost a bit of strength in the bone, or your bone health isn't as good as kind of what
Yeah.
it was versus when you were 30, but it's something that we can work on. It's something we can change. We can improve it at kind of any age, just kind of reassuring them that it's going to be all right.
Yeah,
As
definitely.
long as long as we're like, obviously there's things to still remain vigilant of, like taking falls or um yeah, that kind of stuff where accidents do happen. Um,
Yeah, and I think just making sure, well, I suppose when I'm doing information talks about it, I do try and highlight the gravity of it. Like the risk is fracture. But if someone's actually come in and they've already expressed an interest, often they're already really on board. I don't tell them what the risks are because they know, and I feel like they don't need to be made any more freaked out about it. So I
mhm,
suppose that's the difference. Educating a big group, make sure they know this is important. Lots of people get it. The risks are not very pleasant. People that have opted to come and fix it or help it, yeah, just do the kind of positive, go down the positive route of telling them what they might expect to benefit if they start strength training.
mhm. It's a perfect segue. Like, what is the first thing that you kind of tell them to kind of get into? Like, just currently working in the NHS at the moment, I still get the narrative of like you are like a little bit frail. You should start in the pool, or you should kind
Oh,
of be doing like literally yesterday had someone who said, "Oh, I shouldn't be doing any kind of load bearing, weight bearing impact work because yeah, my bones are weak." So that was a very interesting conversation and a difficult one to try and get them to engage with treatment. But yes, what would you kind of start with for treatment, and what would you be kind of educating people that does actually help for their bone density?
yeah. I think again, I reckon it's easier here because heaps of the time they've come referred from a GP or a friend and they already know about the weight bearing exercise thing. I almost never get someone who doesn't know that's what they need to be doing. But I do
Cool.
if yeah, but if they're completely unaware, I just say the research, the way I explain it is your skeleton is a living thing inside your body and it changes and adapts according to the loads you place upon it. And it appears that our day-to-day lives that we currently live do not place enough load on the skeleton for it to adapt and get stronger, and your body's super efficient, so it goes, oh, we're not really loading those bones much, we probably don't need as much of them, so we'll start um, making them smaller and taking some strength away from them instead of building them up. So we need to do things that are much harder than what you would do on a day-to-day basis to promote them to go, oh, there's something hard happening, I need to be strong to allow that to happen better in future. I often use like the blister or calluses analogy,
Mhm.
where it's like if you start doing something often, your body will adapt and get stronger to accommodate that new thing. So I sort of start by saying that and sort of go, okay, with osteoporosis, they previously thought that it wasn't safe to do harder forms of exercise, but now in the last 10 to 15 years, there's been lots of studies that actually tried to challenge that and get people to actually start pushing themselves and lifting a little bit heavier. And those studies found that we could actually improve bone density that way, or at least slow down the loss, and that it's quite safe and that there's not a very high number of negative outcomes from doing that. And so that's how I sort of set things up. I am like, I probably do say to them, but it's not risk free. There's like nothing is without risk. Sometimes things come up, but the risk of not exercising is much higher than the risk of exercising. And usually the things that might come up from exercise are small and you'll recover from them more quickly than if you're not exercising. So that's how I like set it up. And then I do say, don't worry. The way we're going to do it is very, very gradual. I'm saying that you're going to do these things that are much harder than normal, but we build up to that over a really long time. And almost everyone who I meet is in the same position as you, the person sitting in front of me, whereby they've like never stepped foot in a gym in their life. So don't worry, I'm used to doing this. And everyone like starts at a low base and we build it.
Yeah.
So that's what I
Cool. And it can be definitely intimidating to step into like being told you've got this like chronic health disease that is like kind of scary, and then you've got to do something that's potentially scary for you. So yeah, I think the way you explained that is pretty cool. When you start, so like how often would you get someone to kind of start their training? What kind of loads are you using? Are we just, obviously we're basing it on where the person is at, but are there any kind of guidelines or kind of heuristics that you go off just to start?
Yes. So there are ESSA guidelines out for osteoporosis exercise, which at least just uses a vague guide. And the guidelines say that you should do resistance and high impact training minimum of twice a week. And I guess that's also the WHO guidelines for exercise for adults, that they should be doing resistance training twice a week. And so I always suggest that people start doing it minimum twice a week. And it really depends where they're at. So I kind of do just have a generic idea in my head that you'd be very familiar with, of foundation movements that I will go through with people, like a squat, a hinge, a lunge, a push pull upper body, like vertically and horizontally. Just your standard gym program, full body
General
thing.
preparation.
Yep. And then it's dosed where they're at. And so if they're 65 and have never exercised before, I'm super careful. I have learned the hard way that they get really hectic muscle pain the next day and it can massively turn them off. So I'll do something like, sometimes it'll be like 5 sit to stands, maybe 5 lunges each leg and just 2 rounds. And I will leave it at that because I've learned like that is enough to give them like terrible quad DOMs for days. But then a lot of the people I get are sort of 45, 50, pretty active already. So we might go straight to, okay, like, let's look at what your squat looks like. Okay, let's try doing a goblet squat. If they're pretty good and they've been in a gym before, we'll put a barbell on their back. So it really depends, but it still has that kind of foundation thing of full body exercise twice a week with all the main movements in there. The ESSA guidelines mentioned, like, and this is where there's some debate about whether you need to do impact loading or not, like jumping stuff. And I'm like on the fence with it because I feel like maybe you don't need it because there's studies that improve bone density without it. My thought is there's benefit to jumping anyway, because if you don't use it, you lose it, and it helps promote tendon health and all these things. But if someone has osteoporosis, I'm very gradual about it because, as I said, I have had a few people who have done these tiny things before they've come to me and given themselves insufficiency fractures in the hip and knee. And it's really shown to me like, wow, if someone has osteoporosis and they jump, it is actually, you got to be real careful with it. Less careful than I was at the start. So I'm slow with that. And it might be like, they just do a little like squat to calf raise thing. And then once they've been doing it for a few weeks, we might just do like 3 sets of 5 tiny little jumps, progress it from there. Whereas on the other hand, if they're younger and it's only osteopenia and they have been doing exercise recently, we'll go straight to like squat jumps and do lateral leaps holding a weight. And, you know, again, huge spectrum.
Yeah. Something that usually I would do for like the impact side of things, I don't know if you'd do this, would be things like stomping or like supported jumping. So like having them hold onto the kitchen bench and like do a little jump so that they're getting some upper limb and lower limb loading, but it's not like the magnitude isn't as big. Have you got any other kind of little ideas or little intros into kind of impact? Like you mentioned, the calf raise, like stomping's a good one.
Yeah, stomping's good. I tend to do the squat to calf raise, then holding onto a barbell in front and doing like tiny little, like just leaving the floor. Then I might do like, yeah, I might do like kind of going from one leg to the other, but with a little bit of like more energy than just stepping.
Yep.
And then like for some people, I'm just thinking of for some people, I leave it there because they might be higher on the frailty sort of scale. And I'm thinking, we're already doing all this other stuff. The guidelines have lots in there for jumping. I think the guidelines say you should be jumping like 5 days a week, up to 50 reps. I have it here for low impact loading for low risk individuals. High impact activities more than 4 times body weight. That's quite hectic. But yeah, 4 to 7 days a week, 50 jumps per session. Like that's a lot.
Definitely if you're going to start with it.
That's for people that are low risk. And then moderate risk people, yeah, it's still saying 50 jumps per session, 4 to 7 days a week. Like that's a lot. I just sort of, we will probably do in the realm of 50 in the session, but graduated. And when you're saying giving people stuff to do at home, I don't do heaps of that because the way my business is that they come to do the classes. But I am really interested in how we can make it more accessible for people to do stuff at home.
Yeah. So, no, perfect. What we've kind of gone over in our bone series so far is kind of just, we've looked at all the research and kind of came up with like guideline parameters on how much you can do or how much you should be doing to actually stimulate kind of bone growth. So like you mentioned, the 50 impacts or the 50 kind of above threshold impacts, what we've kind of seen is you need about 25 minimum to actually stimulate something. But it tends to kind of peter out after 100, and that's in healthy individuals. So
that's really interesting.
When we're getting like people with like differences in their bone health or not normal, quote unquote, normal bone health, I think working up to those guidelines is even like just for a few weeks or a month, whatever it might be kind of is definitely appropriate before just getting someone straight into doing 50 impacts of any sort. But yeah, the other thing you mentioned was like 3 or 4 times body weight with your loading for kind of say a squat or a deadlift or anything like that. It sounds pretty hectic, but we know that like, for instance, running puts like up to 8 times ground reaction force through your shin and your hip and things like that. So your jumping and your hopping and things like that can actually provide like 7 or 8 times body weight pretty quickly. So yeah, if someone is osteoporotic, I'd definitely take my time building it up with that. But yeah, I think the other thing we've kind of talked about is the frequency of how many times a week you would do it. So bone kind of resensitizes in about 4 to 6 hours, but that doesn't mean that the rest of the person has kind of caught up with their bone. So like you mentioned, starting 2 times a week is definitely probably enough for someone who's gone from doing probably nothing or have started this completely new program. So everything you kind of just said and everything that the ESSA guidelines for people not in Australia is the Exercise and Sports Science Australia guidelines. That all kind of fits in that as well. So yeah, that's that ticks all our biases and basically confirms what we've been doing. So that's reassuring. And we kind of did touch on the nitty gritty there of the actual programming, starting with kind of, your basic squat, pull, push, hinge movements. However, like people are still a little bit, I don't know, they're a bit particular about certain exercises. And before we came on the podcast, we were talking about some of the things with the BJSM guidelines saying that you should be avoiding certain movements. What's your kind of take on, are there movements to avoid training? Are there movements that we should definitely be training?
Yeah, I think so. A lot of the things that I based my classes on is on the Bone Clinic, Lift More research. I know there's way more studies out there, but I think that is a study that at least shows, hey, if you do these squat and deadlift movements and overhead press, it might help improve your bone density, and it's probably safe. And I look at that and go, yeah. And also, like, those are ways to like load up exercises. You can load up a squat and a deadlift much more easily than many other things, just because of how they're done, you know, because you can load a bar with plates and stuff. And so I do like doing squats and deadlifts in my classes specifically for bone health. And then I also know that even if you have a neutral spine in those movements, like if you're looking at it and it looks neutral, I know that it's actually in flexion. I learned that from like Greg Lehman or whatever.
Greg
Thank you,
Lehman,
Greg.
yep.
Yep. And so then when you read the stuff about osteoporosis and these new BJSM guidelines, they sort of specifically talk about it's important to be straight and to avoid spinal flexion. And so I find that it actually says on them, you should be doing deadlifts, but then it also says to avoid spinal flexion. And I suppose they are referring to loaded end range spinal flexion for someone who's had a vertebral fracture or for someone who's more frail.
Mm-hmm.
I definitely don't think you should avoid anything altogether, but I suppose it is known that loaded flexion end of range is a risk for a vertebral crush fracture. And I know like rapid rotation is another one, but then I look at it, like heaps of my clients are playing golf and stuff, and you know, that's rapid rotation. So I think it's very difficult to go hard and fast, like avoid this, full stop. I suppose I guess what I do with my clients is no one's going full hard out, like max effort, going real hectic on anything, and everything has progressed very, very, very slowly. Like I've sped it up a little bit, but for some of my people, we'd work up to doing like a really heavy, like 1RM deadlift across a year. Like it would be extremely slow, and you could sort of tell that they were nowhere near max effort. Like occasionally people that are not frail, people that might not even have osteoporosis, they're just trying to prevent getting it. But for those sort of more frail ones, I tend to sort of think if you progress it gradually enough and everything's been going okay, I am just assuming that it's fine, because no one knows for sure. And if you look up the studies, like say Liftmore trial or Belinda Beck, like the Bone Clinic, they publish papers all the time talking about the clinic, and they're doing deadlifts all the time with all their clients, and they're not recording or reporting spinal fractures. And so I suspect that comes from like an old fashioned, like, no, they're doing no exercise at all. They're very osteoporotic and they bend over while picking up their shopping heavy, and they're completely unused to it, just like with everything. So I don't necessarily avoid anything with them, but that's not to say it's just like full blown YOLO, like go crazy, just do whatever you want.
Yep.
I think in practice, it's a lot more kind of careful than you might think if you see my Instagram and you see these ladies like lifting these hectic weights and stuff, but it's been a very slow road to get there.
Yep. It's gradual process. You don't overshoot. If anything, you'd rather undershoot, especially in this population to start with. And like it's not a race. Like it's not one of those things where you need to be like, we're not expecting to cure osteoporosis or like mitigate the effects of having osteoporosis like in a month or 2 weeks or something like that. I think the education points around that have to be like, this is going to be a process that you're probably going to have to engage with for probably the rest of your life in some amount. Would you kind of agree with that? Is that how you tell your...
Yeah, definitely. I do think something that is tricky probably from our side is, again, that those ESSA guidelines do talk about how heavy it has to be, and they talk about it being I think 80 to 85% 1RM. And I do think you can probably take that with a grain of salt, because I think a lot of studies that are done on this, say lift more, it's comparing super heavy lifting to really light weights that they haven't progressed at all. And so then the conclusion is, oh, it has to be really heavy. But I don't know if we know that for sure.
Haven't checked the middle.
Yeah. And I did try and like look to see where that's at. And I like, even when you look at the systematic reviews and stuff, the groupings they put, like when they compare high intensity training, like really heavy lifting training compared to moderate, when you look at what's actually in those groupings, it's not, I don't reckon we know. And just completely anecdotally, I have had some clients who were very worried about lifting heavy, and we never really progressed past, say, like a 40-kilo deadlift. We just kept it the same weight the whole time.
Mhm.
And they had these, anecdote for sure, but they had these dramatic improvements in their bone health. And so I feel like for people that want to lift heavy, I facilitate gradually going heavier. For people that are scared of it, I sort of still facilitate trying to do more reps, but it still be kind of hard on the last few reps, because that's still going to be much harder than what they're doing day to day.
Mhm.
And then even if there's people that are just like terrified and they just want to keep their really light weights, I still think all of it counts. And like bone density is hugely important, but so is trying to prevent muscle loss and falls prevention and balance and all that stuff. So whatever level the person's working at, it's going to benefit them in some way.
Mhm.
And just like two, you know, the guideline saying there needs to be 85% 1RM, like people that have never lifted before who are 65, doing only 5 reps, they are probably not doing 85% 1RM. And so even the study that's like, this is how heavy they were lifting, it's like, but were they? Because I've met these people and I work with them all the time.
How did you
And
test that?
yeah, it's all very, yeah. And so I do things with mine just as a little side thing. I change my programming every 6 weeks,
Mhm.
and I'll do things like in the middle, we sort of have like a higher volume block where we'll kind of do higher, like say 5 rounds of 6 on the deadlift or something. And then I'll do things like we'll do 2 rounds of 5 reps, 2 rounds of 4 reps, 2 rounds of 3 reps, or something like that, to kind of gradually creep the weight up. And once they've done that and they felt the heavier weight, I'll kind of swap it to how I would train as powerlifter and go, we'll do some warm-ups. Then we're going to start with the heavy set first. We'll start with the heavy weight you did at the end of the other one. And then they
Mhm.
sort of, it's so much easier doing it that way. And, you know, we'll kind of build it up like that. So sort of like inching in this
Nice.
introduction to heavier loads, because I
Mhm.
find with, you know, they're often undershooting. They're really undershooting. They're not going anywhere near as heavy as they could. So I just use those as ways to kind of like show them that they can go heavier. And often then if you throw it, if they're doing high reps for a while, if you then go, okay, we're only going to be doing like sets of 2 in this block, they're often just like shocked at how easy it is. And, you know, then they realize how much heavier they can go. And then you can use that to base the next round on. So I find that helpful in like this population.
And it makes it like fun. And if you can see that, like, oh, I am actually pretty strong and like I'm enjoying lifting something heavy and it's not like grinding me into the dirt, like I want to keep going with this. Like, I think,
Yeah.
well, from like a lifting point of view, everyone kind of catches that bug at some point of like, oh, like I like getting
Yeah.
stronger. It's good. So if we can kind of foster that in people who haven't done it before, like how you mentioned, just gradually and then giving them little kind of tastes of what they can do, then yeah, that sounds like a pretty good way to get them to like one, enjoy it, and then two, like engage in that process longer term, which is going to be the most important thing for them.
Yeah. And I have found that heaps of them do get really invested in what they can lift. And so then they, because you can progress on that relatively quickly, they can see that progress and they want to keep coming, which I
Mhm.
think is quite unique to strength training, because with other types of exercise, it's not that instant. And I
Mhm.
think it is helpful as well, often that they can see other people that look like them
Mhm.
doing it. It's quite good now because I've got these people that have been coming for ages. And so they'll see someone lifting really heavy. And so they look at that person and go, oh, okay, she's my age and, you know, she can do that. Maybe I can. And so that helps motivate them to try harder.
Yeah.
It's a good,
Or at
yeah.
least feel safe to do it. Because like, especially in a like, yeah, the old patriarchy, the old how women are treated through the years and things like that. They're told to be like ladylike and they're fragile and they shouldn't be doing these things. There's so many barriers to engaging in like heavy strength work and things like that that's going to stop especially women, unfortunately, from engaging in the things that is super beneficial for them. How often do you see that as a barrier, and like how would you kind of or overcome that barrier or help someone work through those kind of ideas and beliefs that aren't necessarily true?
Mm. I think that um, when they're younger women, there's a barrier there that they think they're going to get muscly.
Mm.
And when they're older women, I mean, I'm still shocked sometimes when the older women are like, I'm really worried about gaining muscle. I'm thinking, you're definitely not going to. And also, it'll be so expensive.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I'd say that in the older people, the barrier is way more about fear of injury.
Mhm.
the younger people, the barrier, and when I say younger, I basically am only talking about people like over 40 still. The barrier is getting muscly. Which is, it's disappointing because I have a few different ways of doing it. Like obviously in my Instagram and stuff, I try to avoid talking about body image, but I suppose in general, I try to promote that having muscles is really good for you. And so I sort of have a general narrative that building muscle is good. But I'll sort of tell them, oh, in order to intentionally build muscle, it's very hard and you have to eat more food. And so if you're just sort of doing everything the same, but you add strength training, you're unlikely to build visible muscle unless you also start eating lots more food. And then I will sort of say to them as well, like, I have been, I lift as heavy as I possibly can, and I've been doing it for years, and I'm constantly trying to gain muscle, and like, I can't really. So the chances of you doing it when you're, especially if you're postmenopausal, when there's like not much estrogen, just doing it twice a week, I do tell them it's actually extremely unlikely that you're going to gain muscle. And if you do, it won't be enough to actually like make you physically larger. I hate that I even have to mention it, but I do. The injury prevention, like if they're worried about injuries, I just try to say to them again, like the risk of not doing it's much higher, and that all the injuries I see people with, I see the same injuries whether people exercise or not. So the risk of injury, actually, yeah, there was an interesting, I think, barbell medicine podcast about that. I really wanted to find a paper in it and like tell everyone about it, because they were like, what's the risk of injury just living?
Nothing. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like the same similar rates to heaps of other things. So I try to say, look, I see people who hurt their back doing like literally nothing, and I see people who hurt their back from exercise. The benefits of exercise are so big, it's always going to outweigh it, and that you get better much quicker if you're exercising. And then the other thing is too, I say to them, I'm a physio, so if you have something that starts hurting, which will probably happen at some point, you can still come to class and we can work around it. And that happens. I mean, it does happen all the time that someone's coming with something hurting and we do have to tailor around it. But I think that because we're physios, it gives them way more peace of mind, I have to say. They generally seem pretty like, confident to reassured to do it with me.
Supervising.
It's just because I'm a physio, yeah.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I remember the barbell medicine podcast. I listened to that one. It wasn't that long ago it came out. I think you can expect somewhere between like 3 and 10 injuries in the gym for every 1,000 hours of lifting. And like 1,000 hours, like I don't know about you, but I go to the gym for each time I go, it's like maximum 90 minutes. So that's like 3 hours. So like if I go to the gym 3 times a week and I want to get like 1,000 hours, like that's going to take me like 3 or 4 years. So I can expect like maybe between 3 and 8 injuries over like a 3 or 4 year period when I go to the gym or do something. In contrast to like playing soccer, I think the injury rate for like every 1,000 hours of participation was like 26, and then rugby is like 40. So like on that, it's like literally 20 times, 30 times safer than some like recreational sports are. And then
definitely. Yeah, I think that too. I'm 100% on board with that. But for the older ladies who don't play sport, I can't use that specifically because they definitely aren't going to go and play rugby. But I have used the low injury rate kind of stats with them before. And I mean, it depends. It depends how kind of worried they are. It is funny, like a lot of them something has started hurting and they've kind of just like got off, like they've kept coming and not freaked out. And I actually think that's super powerful because they're like, oh, every time I've had an injury or a pain before, I've just stopped. But you tell me to keep coming. And actually, it's fine. Like it got better quicker or it didn't make it worse. And as soon as that's happened, then they're just like on board. So yeah, it's a big, I'm assuming the people for who it's a really big barrier, I don't meet them because they haven't come in.
Yeah. And potentially they don't even like, and this is not like, unfortunately, this is a societal thing that like they wouldn't even think to engage in like a gym or engage, like they would see that beyond like their current capabilities, or they wouldn't even feel safe to go and see something like that. So I don't know. We've obviously got a long way to go, and you're like doing a really good job at getting more women, older women, especially in the gym, which is awesome to see. So definitely, if anyone doesn't follow you, they should, because it's pretty cool. But yeah, on that, say you've had someone you've trained them for a year or so, you've kind of gotten over all these barriers and things like that. They're enjoying their training. How often do you check their bone density? Like, are you sending them for a DEXA again, like every 6 months or like every year or?
So the recommendation is that they should get it every 2 years, to my understanding. And so most of the time they're already on that pathway with their GP, and I just leave it to them and their GP to kind of keep doing it every 2 years, and then they'll bring it in, and we'll kind of check it. So it's something that I want to streamline and make it way more like, I want to have a thing where we have like a document up where we keep track of it and we measure the progress over time. But most of the time it's like they've come for the first time and then 2 years in, like just following a scan, and then 2 years in, they go and get another one. And so for heaps of my clients, we've had that happen, but we haven't got to the thing where they've had the next one again.
Mhm.
You need it to be that long because often if you've looked at enough of them, you see that most of the time their bone density has just been slowly going down if they've been getting them every 2 years. I think that it says it goes down 1% a year, but I find that so hard to like visualize. But a lot of them have
Mhm.
over the 2 years, it's gone down like ish 3% or 4% at various sites. And so if they start coming to classes, you're not meant to say like, anyway, you're not meant to say like that they started coming to the classes and then their bone density went up, because it's like a health outcome from a intervention. So I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, but anyway, I'm saying it. A lot of them, instead of it going minus, it
Mhm.
swaps to positive. So instead of going minus 2%, it might be positive 2%.
Mhm.
Some of them have gone up heaps, but it like consistently, most people's goes up. And it's crazy when you look at it, because there might be people that have been doing like a few different types of exercise, and you can just see on their thing, it's like every year it's like trending this much down, down, down. And then they all start trending up. And so in order to be clinically significant, I think it's a minimum of 4%. And to be honest, heaps of people don't meet it. And so they look at it and the trends have all swapped from minus to positive, but it says like no clinically significant change. But I just say to them, like, that's in 2 years. So in 2 years, it normally would have gone down 3%. This time, instead of going down 3%, it went up 3%. Extrapolate that to the next like 20 years of your life. That's massive.
Also, that's a
Yeah.
6% change. So like instead
Yeah,
of you
that's
would have
true.
gone down 3%, you have actually gone up 3. So that's 6% on where you would have been if you didn't intervene.
That's true. I'm
So
really bad at stats, and so I like can't picture the percentage.
yeah,
Some
but
people
like,
yeah, sometimes it's epic, like their T score goes dramatically different and stuff like, and that makes them really want to keep coming, obviously. So
mhm.
I do say to them, like, look, like we know the research sort of shows that it's this kind of minimal difference, like 1 to 3%. Again, the studies are too short to show you over a long time. People respond differently, and so some people seem to have like a huge change, some people minor change, some people it just at least like stops it in its tracks, some people it might still go down. I have had a couple of people where it still went down, but so you can't kind of guarantee a result for anyone, but
You could
it's
still
always like,
argue, you can still argue there that, hey, if we hadn't have done this stuff, potentially it could be lower. Like, I
yeah.
don't want to fear you into anything, but like you're doing everything that you should be doing. So,
And especially if they're really recently like just hit menopause, I know that that's when in the 5 years post-menopause, it can be as much as a 10% decline. So for
mhm.
those women, I sort of warn them, you're probably in the like steep decline bit. And so there's a chance that even though you're coming and you're doing everything right, it might still be going down. So I
Mhm.
do kind of like word them up about that.
Yep, cool. Awesome. So yeah, I think we covered a lot there. Is there anything else you think we need to mention or touch on?
I was just going to say the other thing I do talk about them with, which I only started doing recently, is just calcium intake, only because it's in the publicly available osteoporosis kind of health information for patients. And I have a few dietitian patients myself that I checked. Oh, do you reckon it's okay if I bring this up with people? And because it's sort of like
Mhm.
information available to patients, I think it's fine if we mention it. The recommendation is that they need to have 1,300 milligrams of calcium a day from their diet. And I have actually started bringing it up with people because it's a lot. It's a lot. And so
Is
heaps of them
that
like, oh, yogurt for breakfast. I'm like, that's not enough. It's it's so I think a 250 ml glass of milk is about 300 milligrams.
geez. So
And so and I
what do we need? 1,300
women, postmenopausal women do.
post. Yeah, okay. So they'd need to have like 4.5 glasses of milk.
Yes. Um, Yogurt is I think 200 milligrams of yogurt is a similar amount, like 300. Cheese is actually really high, like only 30 grams of cheese, I think, has about 200. They can get it, but it's often just much more, and especially because these, like, often they're these tiny little under 60 kilogram ladies who I don't know how I don't know how they'd get it, but they're definitely not coming close. So I just alert them.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, it's definitely not something that I would bring up first. Like I see it as kind of, it's not like outside of my scope just to make people aware of guidelines, but as for actually giving advice on how to achieve them, like if they're really struggling on themselves, I'd probably just refer them on to dietitians and things like that.
Definitely.
That's actually a pretty important point. Other than yourself and the GP who's involved in this process of managing osteoporosis, there's also the potential for dietitians and things like that. Any other kind of medical or health professionals that you would encourage people to go and interact with?
A lot of people do see endocrinologist. I think that if there's a question around medication, if it was me, I'd want to talk to an endocrinologist because there does not seem to be any clear cut, yeah, this person should go on medication, this person shouldn't. I can't pick any sort of pattern with my patients. It's 100% out of my scope. I don't even go there with people, obviously. So an endocrinologist is the specialist who could go through that with them. So, and I do think dietitian for sure. Like, I think your average person who's just osteopenic and they're coping fine, and they're just not that, there's a lot of people that just wouldn't bother with the dietitian side of it. I reckon for people that it keeps going down and it's already osteoporotic, there's people that if it's, or they kind of mention that they're not eating enough or they're not sure what to eat or whatever, for sure, I refer them on. But yeah, I reckon just at least an awareness of calcium intake is okay for us to touch on, but then leave it there. But I think they're the main ones, GP, because the GP kind of refers to the DEXA scans, and then physio or exercise physiologist, and then the dietitian and endocrinologist.
Awesome. Cool. So awesome. I think that's a pretty good kind of snapshot of osteoporosis, everything from how to communicate with people, communicating their results, communicating what kind of treatments they need to do, what kind of treatments they need to do. We kind of touched on that as well. And then also some of the barriers to getting people to engage and making sure that people are seeing everyone they need to make sure they're looked after. I think that was pretty comprehensive chat.
Hope so. Yeah.
Awesome.
I love it.
Yeah. Yeah. So thank you for taking and making the time to come on. Like, it's super valuable for us to be able to talk with other people in the industry who are doing good work like yourself. So yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
So on that note, other than obviously Instagram, which I kind of already plugged a little bit for you, where can people kind of learn more about you or kind of find out a bit more about what you do?
Instagram is where I'm most active for sure. So just FKBphysio. And then I do have my own podcast as well, which is just FKBphysio podcast. I'm not very creative. It's on Spotify. And then if you're interested in attending the classes, I'm in Brisbane, north, like just north. So Bowen Hills and the Valley.
Awesome. Cool. So yeah, thank you everyone for listening in. That's been another episode of the RP podcast. Hopefully it wasn't an RP 10 to get through, but yeah, thanks again for listening and we'll see you next time.